This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We're starting off this Monday's programming with Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. He covers the latest cattle market update, what two recent USDA reports showed in terms of land values, and a summary of U.S. beef exports for the first half of the year. Also ahead, Anthony Zukoff, K-State Extension entomologist, provides information on a pest that nearly all producers should be wary of: Fall Armyworms. We end this Monday's programming with K-State fisheries and aquatics specialist Joe Gerken. He covers the latest red list and the current threats against monarch butterflies and all species of sturgeon. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back for our weekly cattle market update, as we always have on Mondays. And to do that this week, we have with us Lee Schulz. He is a livestock economist out of Iowa State University. So, Lee, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. So, as always, let's go ahead and start by talking about really what the past week showed in our cattle beef trade markets.
We surprisingly moved higher for the week. I think there was some expectation that we would kind of wallow around here for the next couple of weeks as we kind of are still in those dog days of summer. But we've seen prices higher on a live weight basis. I think we're $1 to $2 higher. I've seen prices in the south were mostly in that 135 to 136. Up in the north here, we were in that 144 to 146. So we still see that wide spread between the north and the south. But overall, positive momentum on higher prices. We've certainly seen that in feeder cattle futures as well. I think some of it's due to lower corn prices. We've seen kind of the near-term contracts down there about 10 cents for the week. So that's providing for some support to our feeder cattle, as well as I think, with the higher live cattle prices, you're seeing a few more dollars in feeders' pockets. They're spending it on feeder cattle, and we're seeing the support there. I think you're also, seeing some interest in buying activity as those supplies are a bit tighter out there in the countryside. So I think those are also supporting some of those feeder cattle prices.
Well, that's good to hear. I actually made a trip to the sale barn this past Friday, just coincidentally made my way out there, and it was a busy day there that afternoon.
Well, I think you're still seeing circumstances of the environment, right? As we're still seeing folks dealing with drought. I think that's bringing some yearlings to sale a bit earlier, coming off of that grass or lack of grass. You're also seeing some of those calves being weaned a lot earlier because of lack of moisture. So I think that is maybe providing a little bit larger supply, but understanding that our supplies are tighter, right? And so that's being reflective certainly in those stronger prices that we're seeing.
Well, now that we've covered what really the last week showed in terms of what the markets really looked like, let's talk about a few of the reports that the USDA released recently, and one of those being the Land Values 2022 summary. Tell us a little bit about that.
So this is one of our data points when we look at land values. Certainly our universities provide a lot of this data. I know Iowa State does. I know Kansas State University does, as well as usually your Federal Reserve banks provide surveyed estimates of those land values. But USDA provides one of those very consistent over time sources and reliable sources for that data. Their estimates came out this last Friday. When we look at the cropland value for the whole U.S., their estimate for cropland per acre was $5,050. That was up 14.3% from what we seen in 2021. That would be about $630 per acre more. Now, certainly there's a lot of variability when we look at the per acre value of that land. I'll give you an example. Here in Iowa, we're the second highest to California, and our $8 per acre is about $9,350. And even within Iowa, we see a lot of variation, but that's the state average. You get down to Kansas, and it's $2,950 per acre. Both of those are up dramatically. Actually, Kansas is up 24.5% year over year. Iowa's up 19.7% for the year. Also, when you look at the pasture land value, those are up as well. Here in Iowa, maybe not as much, up about 9% at $3,300 per acre. And so this would be value for that. In Kansas, it's at $1,850 per acre on that value. Both of those up. In Kansas, that was up 23% for the year.
You wonder how much buying of land is really going on in terms of high interest rates that are going on right now. So it'll be interesting to see if that impacts purchasers' decisions when it comes to purchasing land.
Well, and certainly I think, just the lack of availability, right? So, I think as we're seeing, those acres don't come around all that often, even in a market like this where you're seeing high values. So, I think it's certainly something to continue to watch. Interest rates are going to impact certainly the ability to pay higher and higher prices for land, but, it is a scarce resource, certainly. Another indicator that USDA released on Friday, too, was the cash rent survey. So that also provides I think more of a, you think about it from a shorter term investment, right? As land values are much more longer term investment, the shorter term, you see those reflect a little bit more conditions of the marketplace. I'll give you an example. Actually, the highest cash rent we ever seen in Iowa, and still even today, not even looking at 2022's value, is 2014. So coming off those historically high corn prices earlier in the decade, really bid up those cash rent values. Average in Iowa was $260 per acre. Here in 2022, we're just south of that at $256 per acre. So, again, we're reflecting those higher prices, but I would say that the current market's also reflecting the higher input costs. So not just land or cash rent, but also those inputs like fertilizer and seed, for example, that we've seen, especially fertilizer, escalate considerably. So it kind of limits how much we can pay for cash rent, even at much higher corn prices. Kansas, they actually seen the highest cash rents they've ever seen, roughly up about 6% from 2021 value. So, we continue to see this is just on that story of higher and higher input costs for producers. So although we're seeing higher commodity prices, we're also seeing their margins tighten or remain relatively tight because of those higher input costs.
Absolutely. I was talking to someone the other day about how it's nearly impossible these days to enter into agriculture without already having a foot in the door in some way. And land being one of those major things that it's difficult these days to even fathom being able to afford that right off the bat.
Certainly, it's the high asset values. You used to be able to get in with labor, right? You could enter with effectively your own labor, but now just that hurdle on the high asset values. We talked about land, we talked about cash rent today. That's not the only thing, right? As you look at, there's much higher cost of really just doing business today, and that's certainly, I think, limiting the ability to get in, but also expand. Why we've seen these industries contract. It's not just the cattle industry, it's the hog industry as well. It's what producers would like to do as opposed to what they're able to do. And the ability to expand is really predicated on profitability. And we're seeing relatively tight margins right now that's not incentivizing that expansion.
And then I know another summary also came out, and it was looking at the first half of the 2022 year beef exports.
So this is kind of the other side of it, right? We've talked a lot about cost push inflation, right? Where inputs are a lot higher, but we're also seeing demand pull right now. And the U.S. Meat Export Federation released their very positive results when we look at June exports and then the first half of the year exports. I'll just quote them in saying that first half performance of U.S. beef exports was nothing short of remarkable. And this is even considering those growing headwinds. What are those growing headwinds? Well, it's certainly inflationary pressures that we're facing. We're facing currency issues where you're seeing devaluation of currency. So the buying power of a lot of our big customers is waning a bit. But even in the face of that, we're seeing very strong exports. So it speaks to really the strong demand situation. And I think does look sustainable too. There's some opportunities as, we're seeing countries kind of move post-COVID or post-COVID restrictions. So I think there's opportunities there. I think we're seeing, some greater access to places even like South Korea, where we're kind of dealing with lower tariff rates and opportunity to export more product there. So I think certainly, there's some headwinds in front of us potentially, but right now it's a very positive story as we look at exports.
Absolutely. Hopefully has some longevity to it, and especially when we think about demand waning here in the U.S. as we enter out of these summer months and into a period of time where we usually think demand will kind of lessen, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the portfolio approach, right? So we're not, and I think that's the value of our demand picture is, we're not just relying on domestic or export. I think we've shown demand's resiliency, in the face of a lot of these headwinds. That doesn't mean that, there's not potential challenges ahead, and, why we continue to watch, markers for the economy and how that may continue to reform and potential weakness there. But overall, a good demand picture at this point.
Absolutely. Well, Lee, anything we can expect to see in the coming weeks ahead, potentially in terms of major market changes?
Well, when I look at current markets, I think there's nothing to really say we're going to see some softening too much going forward. I mean, we've really seen box beef prices kind of trade in a pretty narrow range, where we're currently at. I continue to look out at the futures prices, and you're looking at a $12 spread right now from August to December on live cattle futures, and from August to April, $20 per hundredweight. So I think there's tremendous lift in futures right now. You're looking at, I think, what realization is very tight supplies coming. And I think, that sets up a lot of opportunities for producers as we think about, prices moving forward, opportunities to kind of mitigate some potential price risk. But we also need to kind of lay in the situation of much higher costs. So as those feeder cattle costs continue to increase, that is eating into feeders' margins as well. So, it's very much managing both sides of that equation from the fed cattle, but also the feeder cattle. And certainly corn prices still remain relatively high compared to what we've seen historically.
Lee, as always, we thank you so much for this update and for your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
Once again, that was Lee Schulz. He is from Iowa State University, where he serves as a livestock economist, joining us for this week's cattle market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with a special guest. His name is Anthony Zukoff, and he is an extension entomologist here at K-State. So thanks for joining us, Anthony.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're going to be talking about a very important topic today in my mind, and that topic is armyworms.
That's right. Yeah, fall armyworm is probably on everyone's mind because last year we had such a terrible time with fall armyworm outbreaks across the state and even in neighboring states.
Absolutely. So I understand that now is kind of the time for us to be looking out for them.
Sure, yeah. Typically, fall armyworm adult moths will start showing up in Kansas the very beginning of July, maybe late June. Usually when corn is about to start tasseling, moths will be attracted to fields to start laying eggs, and in world sorghum as well.
From what I understand, a lot of the migration here comes from Texas. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is an interesting pest because it doesn't actually overwinter in Kansas like a lot of our other pests. And so the fall armyworm adults are active year-round along the Gulf Coast and southern Florida. And every season they end up migrating north and they reach Kansas and even go north of Kansas. But yeah, our source of fall armyworm actually comes from the Gulf Coast up through Texas.
Excellent. Well, in terms of scouting, you mentioned now is the time to start. What really can producers do now to start looking for these pests?
So this pest can be a problem in a lot of our crops in Kansas. Typically tends to infest corn this time of year and sorghum. And the caterpillars are going to be doing a lot of feeding within the whorls. And so when you're out in your field, you'll go ahead and look for ragged-looking whorls with a lot of feeding damage and holes like that. And you'll usually see frass in the whorl. And if you move the plant leaves apart, you typically find the caterpillars themselves. But when they're feeding on the foliage in this stage, on milo and corn, they're not typically a big concern. Producers need to start paying special attention in their milo when it starts to head out, because a lot of damage can be done to milo when the caterpillars are feeding in the heads themselves.
Absolutely. And you mentioned quite a few crops there, but I understand that even alfalfa can be damaged by this pest?
Yeah, so this pest has, there's over 80 different plants that the caterpillars can develop on, and that includes forages, hay, pasture grasses, even lawns. So yeah, alfalfa could be at risk, especially if it's young, just seeded alfalfa. It only takes 1 or 2 caterpillars per square foot in a young alfalfa stand, for instance, to completely destroy that stand. So folks need to scout early and often, basically now through the rest of the season, because this will be a pest up until the first frost.
Wow, so really a pest that all producers should be aware of, regardless of what they're growing.
Exactly.
I know people are probably listening and they're like, well, we've talked about we need to be scouting for this, but if they find armyworms in their crops, what really can they do to help mitigate the problem?
Well, what they need to do is just, if they do find caterpillars, first they need to determine if they're, at threshold or going over threshold. Are they actually going to cause losses? If you do see that there are enough caterpillars to warrant treatment, there are a lot of different products registered in Kansas for treating fall armyworm outbreaks, depending on the crop. And what they can do after that is they could go and access our insect management guides that the entomology department updates every year. And then in those management guides, say for soybean, the soybean insect management guide, they could go in there, look for fall armyworm, and there will be a listing of products available and the recommended rates to treat the caterpillars.
When it comes to being cognizant of armyworms, is there anything else that producers should keep in mind?
I guess I'd just like to emphasize that, scouting early and often is really important, because you want to catch these caterpillars when they are, less than a half inch in size. They go through 6 different instars, or development stages, and once they get over a half inch, the last couple developmental stages, that's when they do the most damage the fastest. So people, they're not out there looking for the tiny caterpillars, and they start seeing, half inch to 3/4 inch long caterpillars. They'll start seeing damage happening really quickly. And when they get that big, they're harder to control with anything that you're using. So you want to catch them early when they're small and control them then. So I'd emphasize that for sure.
Absolutely. So, you emphasize the fact that these young caterpillars can be so small. So really the best way is getting out in their fields and starting now in terms of looking at each acre, or?
Yeah, so when you're out scouting for any pest, just keep your eye out. So the young caterpillars are really small. Their first stage is just 2 millimeters, so they can be easy to miss. There are enough caterpillars to be a concern. Typically, folks looking through their field will start to see a window painting damage on the leaves. And so from a distance, it might look like your leaves are looking a little bluish, a little silvery. And if you start noticing that, look a little more closer for that window painting damage, and then go from there, try to find caterpillars.
Okay, a good key indicator to be wary of. So I know you mentioned that early July is really when the first wave of these insects really comes into the state. So in terms of their life cycle, where does that really mean we're at now?
So as of last week, I was finding relatively mature caterpillars feeding in world sorghum. So these were caterpillars that are all a half inch or larger. And so that first wave of caterpillars from the adults that arrived in the beginning of July, they will be dropping off plants to pupate over the next week or so. And so in the next couple weeks, 1 to 2 weeks, folks should be vigilant in their fields looking for newly hatched caterpillars. So again, they're going to be the real tiny caterpillars hatching out in the next week or two, and then want to start looking for that window painting damage. So that's kind of the timing I'm seeing in my area, and I assume it's probably pretty similar throughout southern Kansas.
When it comes to treating for these pests, is now the time to be doing that, or should they be waiting a bit longer, these producers?
Yeah, so they should wait because we're probably in between the 2 different generations of caterpillars. So wait a week or 2 until you start finding the small caterpillars before you make any treatment decisions.
Absolutely. And we discussed a few of those treatments earlier, but the variability in those, are all of them contact insecticides, or are there some other options as well?
Yeah, as they start looking through the management guides and deciding a product they want to use, there's a variety of things. There are, general pyrethroids that could be contact kill, and there are a lot of things that provide residual protection, so the caterpillars will eat some leaf material that has been treated, and it'll kill them that way as well.
Excellent. So some diversity for producers to work with as well. Well, Anthony, if there's any more information that producers can gather from this, where can they find some of that information at?
They could go online and navigate to the entomology department's website, and that's where we'll have all those insect management guides that I mentioned. There's a bunch of extension publications for other pests. It's pretty much a one-stop shop for anything Kansas pest or insect related there, so I would direct them to the entomology website.
Excellent. Well, as always, when we talk about resources in our show, we always include them in the show notes of our episodes, so that can be found on agtoday.net. Once again, that was Anthony Zukoff. He is an extension entomologist here at K-State, covering fall armyworms. Before we cut to a short break, the USDA recently announced new investments in rural broadband projects. Gary Crawford shares more on the matter in the following report.
Millions of us who live in urban and suburban areas take for granted being able to connect to the rest of the world through our high-speed internet connections. We consider it basically an essential utility like electricity. We pay our bills using it, do our banking, handle our health care, buy and sell products, and even earn college degrees online. But there are millions of rural residents who have little or no access to any kind of high-speed internet service.
Rural communities are the backbone of our nation and have a broad impact on our economy. But for too long, rural communities have been left out.
We are leaving a lot of rural families and a lot of rural businesses and farms behind.
Two voices there. First, White House Infrastructure Coordinator Mitch Landrieu, and then Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, two key players in the administration's efforts to bring rural residents the same opportunities as their urban and suburban counterparts.
It starts with making sure rural communities are connected to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet.
Mitch Landrieu told a news conference the other day it's a huge job. One reason so many rural areas don't have high-speed internet is simply the cost of running the cables to homes that may be miles apart. Communications companies would have to charge customers exorbitant rates to cover even the initial costs. That's why Congress and the Agriculture Department have come up with programs to help defray some of those costs, help pay for projects across rural America. The latest announcement on that coming from Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, who told reporters the other day that through the USDA's Reconnect program, which is designed to bring high-speed internet to underserved communities,
$401 million is being announced today. That includes 20 projects in 11 states. All told, we expect about 31,000 families and businesses in these 11 states to benefit from this investment.
And the 11 states in this case include
Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, New Mexico, Nevada, North Dakota, and Texas.
One of those projects, as you heard there, the state of Nevada. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto told reporters the $27 million project in her state will help build a system in rural Lovelock, Nevada.
To connect 4,884 people, 130 businesses, 22 farms, and 7 public schools across rural Nevada.
And for the folks who finally will get affordable internet,
this is a game changer. There's a need for this connectivity on so many levels, whether it brings telehealth, telemedicine, e-learning, workforce development. It's a connection that is so important.
But this is just one of many Reconnect investments in the works.
There's going to be a constant stream of projects being announced between now and, say, the first part of 2023.
And many more next year, funded by the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has $65 billion in it for rural high-speed internet projects. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Once again, that was Gary Crawford reporting for the USDA. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly wildlife segment. And to cover the segment this week, we have with us Joe Gerken. He is the fisheries and aquatics specialist here at K-State. So, Joe, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Samantha.
Absolutely. We're going to cover an interesting topic today, which we always do. But this week, we're talking about the recent red list that was released.
Yeah, so the International Union for Conservation of Nature has a red list. It's commonly called the IUCN Red List. And that has the species worldwide that are listed as threatened or endangered. So they just had an update sent out that included some fish on it.
Absolutely. And some butterflies, too, as well.
Yeah, so the headline grabber is the Monarch Butterfly was on there, and the monarch is now listed as endangered, largely because of habitat destruction and climate change. But a lot of their habitat is being deforested. We're cutting down a lot of trees, especially in California and Mexico. But also climate change is leading to some changes in their habitat and the availability of milkweed, which is what their larvae grow on.
I saw a lot of milkweed this past weekend. I went hiking on the Kanza, and there's tons of it there. But we were talking earlier, those small areas with tons of it are great, but it's that connecting thing that's kind of the issue.
Right. So these monarchs are migrating thousands of kilometers or thousands of miles. They're migrating from North America down to South America. And so they need to have connectivity patches of milkweed along the way where they can stop and eat and refuel so that they can make that journey. So there might be a big patch, a ton of it at Kanza, for example, but then they might not have enough of it for another 100 miles or so. So they can't really make that journey. They're having trouble with that connectivity.
Absolutely. Now that I've derailed us off of this fish subject that we want to cover, let's talk a little bit about that. Sturgeon, a major concern.
Yeah, so that's actually a great segue. So that connectivity issue is also seen in a lot of rivers and streams around the world. And so what we're seeing is that instead of having natural flowing streams, we now have dams on those streams. And that's preventing a lot of fish. A lot of these fish migrate upstream hundreds of miles in order to be able to find habitat to reproduce. And so we're seeing that dams coming in, habitat destruction in the aquatic realm is also influencing fish. So one on that IUCN list that I wanted to focus on was sturgeon. And so all the sturgeon around the world now are listed as threatened with extinction. So they're not all endangered, but they're all threatened with extinction to some level.
That's crazy when you think about the number of sturgeon species there probably are. So an impactful list to be released for sure.
Sure. So there's 26 species of sturgeon worldwide. Most of our listeners are probably most familiar with pallid sturgeon. That gets a lot of press in Kansas. The most common sturgeon that we have is called the shovel-nosed sturgeon. It's a smaller sturgeon that lives in bigger rivers. It gets to about 5 pounds or so would be the max size. So those are the two common species that we'd see around here, but 26 total species worldwide, all of them are threatened with extinction.
When we talk about wildlife for this segment, we always include that there's some sort of equilibrium. So with these sturgeon species being on the endangered list, what could this mean for our ecosystems?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing it's showing us is that there are some issues that we need to be focused on in freshwater systems. So figuring out, for example, that connectivity we talked about. They make fish passages. They just added one on Bowersock Dam on the Kansas River, for example, where fish can then get upstream. They have a means to swim upstream around the dam. So focusing on some of those connectivity issues, making sure that, we're doing some of the things to protect our freshwater systems, streams, rivers, also ponds. So if you're going out to your own pond, your own land, let's think about the wildlife in those habitats, while we're out there and making sure that the ecology is preserved as best we can.
Absolutely. Maybe plant some milkweed while you're at it.
That's right. And actually, that's another good point. Milkweed is one of the great plants that we could plant around our ponds to help native species like the monarch butterfly while also benefiting the ecology of the pond itself. So great idea, Samantha.
Wow, look at me. I know a little bit more than I thought I did. If listeners are tuning in and they want to maybe find out a few more other species or they're curious about other species that are on this list, where can they find that information?
Yes, the IUCN Red List, so the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or just typing in IUCN Red List would be a great resource to start looking at. Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks always has great information about our Kansas-specific species, and then always reach out to your local extension agents or a wildlife specialist if you have questions specific to your habitat.
Joe, as always, we thank you for your time and for this insightful conversation.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Joe Gerken. He is a fisheries and aquatics specialist here at K-State, covering some recently listed endangered species on the Red List. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.